protests in Sri Lanka, reports suggest Gotabaya Rajapaksa has now fled the country. Amid the political turmoil, Sri Lankan Prime Minister resigns paves the way for new all-party government. But some here in the opposition are now celebrating, drawing a Lanka link to India's issues. India's neighbour Sri Lanka is reeling under a massive economic crisis. Angry protesters saying enough is enough as the country faces shortage of essential supplies as well as fuel. Today, thousands of protesters laid siege to the capital, Colombo. Protesters stormed the president's residence amid reports that he fled the country. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe held an emergency meeting of the party's leaders where he announced his decision to resign and pave way for an all-party government. But the question here is, how did it come to such a stage? Who is really responsible for Sri Lanka's mess? Let's debate.
Watch how thousands of protesters laid siege to the Sri Lankan president's residence and office as reports of him fleeing the country surfaced. From taking a dip in the president's swimming pool to storming the kitchen and his bedroom, complete chaos prevailed as Sri Lankan forces struggled to maintain law and order. As the Sri Lankan government restricted non-essential vehicles from accessing petrol, long queues of people were seen outside petrol stations. Tear gas shells were fired by Sri Lankan police to quell the massive protests over the island nation's worst economic crisis in recent memory. Joining the protests, a police officer stopped his motorcycle, took off his helmet and joined the protesters on the streets of Maharagma. As Sri Lankan forces tried to take control of the president's residence, protesters were seen blocking them. As reports surfaced of President Gotabaya and his family escaping the country, Sri Lankans took to the streets to celebrate. Alarmed by the deteriorating state of affairs, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe called for an emergency meeting of party leaders, announcing that he was stepping down to make way for an all-party government to take the country out of the crisis. But who is responsible for the Sri Lankan crisis? Did the Chinese debt trap cause the Lankan crisis? Let's debate.
Well, who's exactly responsible for it? Let's not forget that the all-weather friend, or rather, should I say, the so-called all-weather friend, China, is squarely to be blamed. Between 2005 and 2015, there was much enthusiasm that was shown by China to perhaps fund this entire project, the infrastructure project spree. Joining us on this broadcast is the governor of the northern province of Sri Lanka, Jeevan Thyagaraja. Mr. Thyagaraja, thank you very much for speaking to Republic TV. Let me straight away begin by asking you, what's the condition right now? It seems that things are completely out of control. I would also like to ask you this question as to who exactly is really responsible for this current mess that Sri Lanka is in right now.
There are several parts to the response that I'd like to give you. In terms of your first part of the question, what's the state? There was prior notice of the fact that we were going to have a very large protest today, which is what occurred. But it's a build-up to something that began before May. So that's been a considerable amount of time. It's been simmering. We've had resignation of a prime minister, the formation of a government, battling chronic shortages of gas and fuel. We have had power cuts, but the power cuts have been better now. And rising cost of living. It's a pretty toxic environment where people are severely affected in their day-to-day lives. And in terms of dealing with the issues, I must say that the experts, the technical experts dealing with our debt issue, I was quite comforted by the fact that they had come to grips with our debts and the debt payments. So that is a very good thing. On the other hand, we had the day-to-day issues of being able to procure sufficient fuel, gas, etc. And that's been a struggle, partly because we defaulted. So international trading is a very different environment once you've defaulted. So that's where we were in great difficulty, notwithstanding the massive infusion from India of food, medicine, finances, and fuel. So it came to a head one more time today, physically, but on the back of that was the demand for reform of the Constitution, where what is now called the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution is pending adoption. So many things came on the road. So in a sense, I think the common person boiled over, professionals came online. They were asking for change. And I think what happens anyway around the world is that people want to hold a person responsible, if not a group of persons responsible. So that was the culmination today. That was in the morning. There was a meeting of the speaker with all the political parties. I believe the president has indicated that he would go with the decision of that particular meeting. The decision of that particular meeting is to call for the president to resign as well as for the prime minister. But then you can't have people going home and nobody coming into office. So that particular phase is what's on the table at the moment. How does one ensure there is continuity of office of the commander-in-chief as well as the prime minister? Overall, I would say that we have been fortunate that there has been no mortalities. There have been some injuries, and not the kind of damage that could have occurred to physical infrastructure hasn't occurred. But there has been intrusion into key government institutions, and that is a matter of extremely serious concern. There was a second part to your question. Can you please remind me if you don't mind?
Mr. Tyagraj, I was asking a direct question. Who exactly is really responsible for it? I know it's difficult to really pinpoint by, simply saying that it's economic mismanagement by successive governments, but also the fact that the family in itself, as the protesters have been alleging, they were perhaps busy filling up their own coffers.
Yeah, I think on matters such as this, as a governor, I can speak on the constitutional aspects of things, on arms of government. But I can't go into the politics of politicians and the parliamentarians. But one thing I can say is that even a governor faces this, and sometimes in the geographical area of the governance of the governor, governor is the last stop of appeal, where people come up with appeals, complaints of all manner of things, irregularities to corruption to whatever. And one has to take an extremely forensic view of this and test it before the law. So any and every perception of irregularity, corruption and other must be tested before the law. I think is the way to go, because any other way outside would be anarchic.
Mr. Tyagraj, bear with me. I would just like to take one more question just to understand the current situation on the ground and how exactly is the administrator trying to quell the protests, because it's going to be important that there isn't a loss of lives. So how exactly is the administration now planning to quell the protests?
Yeah, very, very interesting question, because as a governor also, even though my domain is the north, I spent considerable energy today talking to His Lordship, the Chief Justice. I think I've spoken several times to the Attorney General, to the Office of the Army Commander, to the Office of the Speaker, Office of the Inspector General of Police. For the simple reason that the backdrop to this was that to date, many of the courts have said, you have power, use it. Don't ask us to take preemptive steps because you have enough power to do your job. Now, here what's happening is I think the armed forces and the police are stretched and they need legal backing for them to act. Also, they're dealing with significant numbers, and also one must confess and be candid, while you can be very tough and enforce the law, we are in the middle of a very tricky situation of IMF negotiations and so on and so forth. And my understanding of the IMF is that if there's any kind of violence and chaos in the country, they hold back. They say, look, ensure that there is order, etc., before you come back to us. So even the armed forces and police have been restrained simply because they can't act in the way they would normally do to maintain law and order. So that has led to, I would say, people taking the law into their hands. Now, if, and God forbid, this shouldn't happen, if crowds start taking over key government institutions, we'll be in a lot of trouble. And we mustn't go there. And that's why I believe that probably is a Security Council meeting at some point very soon, if not today, where the armed forces chiefs and the police will take a call on this, as well as the Prime Minister. It's a delicate state, and there's overwhelming perception that freedom must not be trammeled, people must be free to protest, etc. Equally, we mustn't start breaking the law and breaking down institutions. Bringing institutions back to life is a gigantic task. We mustn't go there. It's delicate. It's very delicate. But I must say that, once more I can say that no loss of life, some injuries certainly, lots of activism from the Bar Association, etc. And the courts in general have held with the people to date. So a very delicate balance, I must say.
Mr. Tyagaraja, thank you very much for speaking to Republic TV. Let's also go across to our reporters on the ground to get a sense of what's really happening, and then perhaps also go across to our guests, because the bigger question that one needs to ask at this point in time, that who's really responsible for this current mess. I'm told that Lahiru, who's joining us from Colombo at this point in time. Lahiru, just take us through the details that you're picking up right now. You've been covering the protests for Republic TV through the day, getting us reports from across various parts of Colombo. What's the current situation? And then perhaps you could also take through a few more questions with regards to what perhaps is the future plan. Let's first begin. What's the current situation like?
The situation at and in front of the presidential palace and the presidential secretariat is quite normal, and all these policemen and security forces who were deployed to this area are now being transferred to the Prime Minister's house, because the tense situation, the fighting and all of that is now taking place in that area where the protesters are clashing with authorities. And so far we can see that now you can see a police truck loading up policemen, and there are a few other police buses as well loading up policemen to be transferred to that area where the protesters have to by the authorities. And so far at this place, people are calm, they're celebrating, and they're also demanding the president to resign, and you can see it in their emotions. Most of them are hungry. They have skipped meals. Some haven't even had a single meal for the day, but they have still come here. They have told their stories through loudspeakers. They're telling people, they're inviting people to come and join them to spend the night and to spend the rest of the days till the government resigns. And we cannot see any other, and we can't see an end here. This looks like just a beginning.
Lado, I would also like to take another question with you with regards to the multiple meetings that have already taken place. It seems the Prime Minister has already paved the way for an all-party government to be brought in. Would that really perhaps quell the protests on the ground, because the demand essentially being that the government should go?
So the people who are protesting here need the president and also the Prime Minister to resign. They believe by appointing this Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, the resignation of the president was only delayed, and they want both of them out. And so far, we've got to know that the Prime Minister, he has said that he will be resigning. All his cabinet has also said that they are also resigning, and some of the cabinet ministers have said they are also resigning from the ruling party, the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, and they are going to remain as independents. But the question remains, the opposition is still divided. Most of the opposition parties cannot form themselves under one leader. The opposition leader, Sajith Premadasa, today was not seen in any of these protests doing any leadership role. We've got to know that he has been admitted to a private hospital for symptoms of a virus flu. But people are questioning where the opposition leader is. There's no leadership behind this protest, and which is why experts are saying this could lead up to anarchy, and this could also lead up to more trouble if there is no leadership, if there is no power vacuum. If there is a power vacuum, that will be worse for this country, and that is what experts are saying. And people are also questioning who is leading the country right now, because the government is now unresponsive.
Well, thank you very much, Lairu, for getting us those reports from Colombo. We'll keep coming back to you for the latest as the situation still remains quite volatile. Let's open up the debate, the burning question tonight. Who exactly is really responsible for this current mess that Sri Lanka is facing right now? Many would raise these questions on your screens. As you see, we already have a guest from Beijing. Perhaps Beijing really needs to do some answering at this point in time. The instability that we are really looking at right now in Sri Lanka, and how exactly is China responsible for it? On the burning question tonight, we have Dhananath Fernando. He is the COO of the Advocate Institute, joining us live from Colombo, and Victor Gao, who is a strategic affairs and geopolitical expert, is joining us from Beijing. We also would be having more guests joining us in a short while from now. Let's open up the burning question here. Dhananath Fernando, isn't China squarely to be blamed for the current situation right now in Sri Lanka? And let me qualify my opening remark by saying that why I would say that China is really responsible. Mr. Gao seems to be delighted when I'm asking this question. Mr. Gao, I'll be asking you very pinpointed questions tonight because I come armed with certain facts. Let's begin with certain facts. Between 2005 and 2015, China has emerged as Sri Lanka's leading source of development assistance and the FDI. Now, how exactly are the Rajapaksas really responsible for it? Rajapaksas specifically picking up certain Chinese firms, money flowing in without much accountability, infrastructure projects which were never completed. And as the protesters say, it does appear, Dhananath Fernando, that the Rajapaksas were busy filling up their coffers, and the Chinese were delighted because they finally got the island nation under their belt.
Yes, Sanjay. So in my view, if you look at the debt portfolio, we have about 10% external debt for Japan and about 8 to again 9% external debt owed to China. and then balance for India and some other countries. So in my view, while we have taken debt from China, which is expensive and which is quite a large amount of money, but I see it as also mainly the irresponsible mismanagement from our side, because we have been taking at very high interest rates. And if you look at the main debt component is international sovereign bonds, which was more than 50%. So in terms of our borrowing, it is pretty much skewed mainly towards more than 50% towards from the international sovereign bonds. So I feel it is the wrong strategy that we have implemented on the debt side, and that is led to the crisis, the economic crisis on one hand, but I would broadly see it as a sequence of mismanagement and misfortune at the same time. Because if you look at the recent history since 2015, we had both a combination of mismanagement and misfortune. 2015, there was a bond scam. 2016 and 17, we had a massive drought. 2018, we had a constitutional coup. 2019, we had the terrorist attack, the Easter attack. 2020 and 21, we had COVID. And in 2022, we had the economic crisis with shortages. So I would broadly see it's a combination of mismanagement and misfortune. But I agree that our debt management has been very
Mr.
poor.
Fernando,
We
we're just
borrow
getting in some
excessive
breaking news
amount
right
of
now.
money at very high interest rates.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Fernando, because we're getting in some breaking news right now. An interim Prime Minister's name is now doing the rounds. We'll get you more details in a short while from now. Mr. Fernando, you've pointed out what could be the reasons and how exactly are the Rajapakses responsible for it. Joining us on this burning question is also Major Gaurav Arya from the National Capital. Major Gaurav Arya, I just want to add to what Mr. Fernando had to say a short while back. And I would say Mr. Victor Gao, who's been waiting patiently, but before I go across to him, I would like to place certain things on record. Now, why exactly is the situation the way it is right now? First, you have the Sri Lankan leadership handpicking certain Chinese firms to invest in specific projects. Then you have them signing abstract agreements, promoting opaque companies, investments, accepted loans with higher interest rates than those offered by the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. And then, Major Gaurav Arya, let's not forget, they also rejected and made it difficult for investments to come in from India, Japan, as well as the United States. And as Victor Gao has been smiling all through this debate, Major Gaurav Arya, they are still smiling, and they like the situation. They like the situation right now in Sri Lanka. They like the instability. And one would say draw a parallel between what's happening in Sri Lanka and what's also bound to happen in Pakistan.
Very well articulated, Shawan. The fact of the matter is that China gives loans, all these loans at very high interest rates, infrastructure projects that nobody needs. For example, in Sri Lanka, you have the Hambantota port. You also have that international airport where apparently Forbes covered the story, BBC covered that story. It was also covered by Al Jazeera and CNN that no flights land at their airport. So what happens is that essentially China gives these kinds of loans to countries that are small, with small populations, countries that have a corrupt elite, countries that are inherently politically unstable. They have done this in Africa, they have done this with Pakistan. Now, Sri Lanka is a different case because Sri Lanka is one country that has tons of potential. I mean, there is nothing stopping Sri Lanka. But yes, financial mismanagement, as Mr. Fernando very rightly pointed out, financial mismanagement by the country's elite is the reason. Otherwise, Sri Lanka is blessed with natural resources. It has great maritime potential. There is a lot of, fishery, a lot of tourism. There is so much in Sri Lanka. But again, you see the predatory nature of Chinese investment everywhere. Name one country, and I would like to invite Mr. Gao to point out, sir, one country that has taken money from China and prospered. One country, sir, in the world. Africa, call it Nepal, Sri Lanka, and even Pakistan. Everything is going down the drain simply because the nature of the loans are like that. They are never meant to be repaid. Shawan, these loans are never meant to be repaid because they are taken at such high levels. Take the case of Sri Lanka. It's a country that was pretty stable a decade or so back. We would go to Sri Lanka, Indians would go to Sri Lanka and say, wow, what an amazing place. No longer. So obviously this is all man-made. The images that you're seeing, it is not because the Sri Lankans were not good enough. It is not because there was something wrong with Sri Lanka. It is because it is a man-made crisis. Of course, the corrupt elite and the mismanagement and the policies have a very big role to play, but so do Chinese investments. And these investments across the globe have done it. You're very right when you point out towards Pakistan. There is no way Pakistan can pay back Chinese money. Not that the Pakistanis intend paying back anybody's money. That is the last thing on their minds. But the loans are structured in such a fashion that you cannot pay it back. Shawan.
There is a reason behind it, Gaurav Arya, because China has preyed on Sri Lanka's economic vulnerabilities, loopholes and the corrupt practices for its political and economic calculations. But Victor Gao, straight question. You've heard Major Gaurav Arya putting it as succinctly as possible. Name one country whose touch of hands that you have had and they've not actually gone down the drains. Name one country.
Thank you very much for having me. I listened very carefully, and you asked me to name one project. How about the high-speed railway project from Yunnan province all the way to Vientiane in Laos? This is not only the brand new railway for Laos in its history, it's the first high-speed railway throughout the ASEAN 10 countries. So if you talk about real project, this is the real project. Another one you can think about is the railway project in Kenya, linking from the hinterland in Kenya on the mountains all the way to the port city. Now, these are real projects. Do some homework and dig out the information and do the research. Now, another thing, do you know who owns China the most amount of money? It's not Sri Lanka. It's not Pakistan. It's not any African countries. It's the United States. They own China more than $3 trillion US. Why don't you blame the United States for borrowing so much from China? Why do you blame Sri Lanka for borrowing that tiny amount of money from China to sponsor the infrastructure projects? In China, we've learned a very good lesson. Without building a road, without building your infrastructure, you cannot strike gold. You cannot really develop your economy. So if you really want to promote economic development, build a road, build infrastructure project. This is the basic, this is development basic ABC. And I hope we can share this information with all the friends in the world. Allow me also to mention, the world is at a crossroad. We have this financial crisis, food crisis, energy crisis, etc. The real cause for the problem in Sri Lanka is the combination of all these major crises together and breaking
Mr. Gao,
the situation.
I know you're going ahead. Mr. Gao, I did actually come with a lot of research tonight. So let me debunk your myth and that myth of Chinese innocence. For all our viewers who are tuning in right now, let me give you one example. And Mr. Gao, then give me that response. Just to substantiate the argument, China's 10% of lending is often compared to 47% of lending from the private market. So, Mr. Gao, if you actually want the world to believe that there is innocence in your lending and you are doing it out of some sort of a charity, then unfortunately, I think so it's high time for you to believe that the world is smarter than what you really think. Gaurav Arya, I've just put out a fact right now. So what happens is a debt trap. And Gaurav Arya would understand that even better. Someone who's had a very hawk's eye on what's really happening in Pakistan. And he's talking about what's really happening in Vietnam, talking about a singular project. Let's not forget, this debt trap is extremely dangerous, something that the Rajapaksas knew, but it's their populist approach just before the elections actually led to this sort of a debacle. I want Gaurav Arya to respond to this so-called innocence
something in
of
response
the Chinese
to your very
lending.
harsh points.
I'll come back to you. Let Gaurav Arya put you on the mat right now. I want Gaurav Arya to put you on the mat right now, because tonight I gave you the opportunity. And I was aware, Mr. Gao, that you are going to mislead. You are going to mislead. So tonight, what I want Mr. Fernando and Gaurav Arya to actually remind you that the problem here is that in order to so-called have that strategic gain, what you're essentially doing is you're destroying nations. Pakistan would never understand, but it's unfortunate that Sri Lanka has actually fallen into the trap. Gaurav Arya, I want you to respond.
Yeah, so Shravan, the way it happens is that I would like Mr. Gao to tell us what kind of loans were given to Laos and what kind of loans were given to Kenya. And do they have the means to pay back Chinese loans? Why only 2 examples? I can give you 5 more. I just mentioned the Hambantota port, which was built by the Chinese. I mentioned that airport in Sri Lanka where no plane lands. That was also built by the Chinese. It's a fantastic airport. Hambantota port is world class. Look at the Gwadar port of the Pakistanis. It's a great port, except that there are no ships in that port. And that is my entire point. Mr. Gao says that there is a high-speed rail which goes to Laos or to Kenya. There is no disputing the facts by Mr. Gao. All I'm saying is that they don't mean anything. They pick on countries that are small. They pick on countries with a small corrupt elite. They pick on countries that are inherently economically and politically unstable. And they give them loans knowing full well that these countries have no means of returning that loan. They don't want the money back. The last thing that the Chinese want is the money back. They don't want the money back. Right? There is nobody entering the White House in America. Why should we ask Americans why you've taken $3 trillion from the Chinese? We are discussing this because Sri Lankans are entering the presidential palace in Sri Lanka, in Colombo. So, Mr. Gao, my question to you is, sir, Mr. Gao, my question to you, sir, if I may, please, may I, with your permission, Mr. Gao, I would like to ask you, sir, you mentioned Laos and Kenya. Please tell us on what terms and conditions were these loans given? What terms and conditions were these loans given?
Listen, allow me to mention several points. It's getting very late in Beijing. Now, if you tell me any country, big or small in the world, which does not need infrastructure, airport or highways, etc., then I would say you are completely misguided. Because any country in the world, big or small, need to have improved infrastructure. That's the basic thing. Do you know when the United States built their railway system? End of the 19th century. Where did they come up with the money? They borrowed heavily from European banks. And much of those loans were defaulted by the United States in its history. Do you know when the United States built up their national expressway system? In the 1950s. These infrastructure projects lay the groundwork for the rapid economic development of the United States. Now, you tell me that Sri Lanka does not need a high-quality road or port or airport, then, sir, do your homework. I cannot talk with you on the same length because you are misguiding yourself. You are misguiding your audience.
You are right. Mr. Gao, you're right that countries need infrastructure projects. Every country needs it, and I agree with you. All I'm saying is that you have given countries infrastructure projects and they have no means of paying back to you. They have no means of paying back, Mr. Gao. What you take away, when you give money, you know what you take in return. Allow me to just complete one line, sir. Allow me to complete one line. When China gives money, what it takes in return is that country's sovereignty. What you have taken from these countries is their sovereignty.
Listen.
What do you seek for? Sovereignty or infrastructure?
G7, do you know that G7 recently at their summit meeting adopted a resolution promising to lend up to $600 billion to support infrastructure in developing countries? And they say very well, and I hope you listen with your ear, they wanted to do this in response to China's massive assistance to developing countries in the infrastructure sector. Now, if you get China wrong, that's one thing. If you get G7 wrong again, that's another thing. Because it's clear that both China and G7 now conclude that they need to lend massively to developing countries to support their infrastructure, because infrastructure is the basis of economic development. Now, how the loans will be repaid, that's another issue. We probably will not have enough time to talk about finance ABC. If you really want to listen to me, your host has all my email and contact information. I'll be very happy to share with you my expertise in this particular region. After all, I used to work with Morgan Stanley and Taiwan.
You've gone on and on. You've gone. No, you allow others to also respond. You seem to be saying that this is some sort of a charity work that was basically done by the Chinese in order to uplift people from poverty. But let me just tell you, what you've essentially done to Sri Lanka is that put about millions of people into that poverty trap. Let me also go to Mr. Asanga, who's joining us on this broadcast. And Dhananand Fernando, if I can ask you to respond to Mr. Gao, the responsibility once again being on China, because let's talk about what was China's intention. China's intention was this. Let me just tell all our viewers that they always had an eye on projects in the northern islets of Sri Lanka to come closer to India and offset in New Delhi's advantage in the Indian Ocean region. Mr. Fernando, thankfully the government had realized at that point in time, and negotiations resulted in ensuring that China really does not come that close to India at that point in time. But everyone understands this debt trap, which Mr. Gao doesn't seem to really understand. I want Mr. Fernando, I want you to respond to Mr. Gao, our guest from Beijing. What exactly does this debt trap really do to a country like yours?
I'm not sure whether to call it a debt trap or not. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, what really happened was the money that we borrowed was at very high interest rates, including from the financial markets, and we had to borrow more to pay the interest rate. So, for an example, to provide some numbers through, our interest cost is the largest recurrent cost in our budget. So that's what happened. But I'm not putting the blame entirely on China or any country, because I feel it could have been our responsibility. I mean, our policymakers' responsibility to borrow at a reasonable rate. Because when you borrow at very high interest rates and when you're investing it in projects that doesn't generate a dollar revenue, it is obvious that the debt is going to snowball, because you have to borrow more just to service the interest of the debt.
Are we to really blindfold the fact that there was arm twisting? Are we to really blindfold ourselves to really think that your political leadership was not really arm twisted to actually fall into that debt trap? Mr. Asanga, who's joining us also from Colombo, I want you to weigh in right now. The questions that we have actually asked our guests from Beijing right now, to at least admit that what they have essentially done is put this country in a dire situation, and also pry on the economic vulnerabilities of Sri Lanka.
I think the irrational decisions that the regime took, the Rajapaksa regime took, is to be blamed. The debt, if you look at it, borrowing at 6.4%, high interest rate, which is not sustainable. So those are the policy decisions that the Rajapaksas took. We have an airport without flights. So the business models are giving us the revenue. That is what we want. And so unfortunately,
we'll try and reconnect with Mr. Sangha in a short while from now. I just want to quickly go back to Gaurav Arya. Gaurav Arya, there is absolutely no doubt about the role that was basically played by the political leadership. I have absolutely no doubt about that. But having said that, I want you to elaborate on the fact that how this is a well thought out plan, and the Chinese always has this plan of entrenching themselves, and that's exactly what they have done in the multitude of projects that they've got themselves in, and then ensuring that they fall into the trap of not being able to pay, and then forcefully asking them to give up more.
No, Shravan, if you heard closely what Mr. Fernando said, he said exactly the same thing, that the Rajapaksa government or the governments before that took loans that they could not service, and a very large part of their budget would go towards servicing these loans. This is exactly what is happening in Pakistan, Chavan. A large part of Pakistan's annual budget goes in servicing loans, and most of these loans, lion's share of these loans, are taken from China. In fact, things have gotten so bad with Pakistan, and I'm giving the Pakistan example since you mentioned it at first, is that the IMF has told the Pakistanis that, listen, if you want to come into the IMF program, you'll have to stop taking loans from the Chinese, because Chinese loans are crippling your economy. Which is exactly what I'm saying. I mean, yes, Mr. Fernando is right when he says that it was their own government that did the wrong things, by taking loans at very high interest rates. But this is what happens when you have a corrupt elite. Chinese will go. There are stories in Pakistan about bribes being offered and people taking loans. There is massive corruption in all these infrastructure projects on the part of the host country. I'm not saying on part of the Chinese. I'm saying on the part of the host countries. There are so many people in Pakistan who are billionaires because of Chinese money. They've stolen that money. They stopped the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. They've stopped that economic corridor. Same thing has happened with Sri Lanka. Of course, Mr. Fernando is right when he says that, our mismanagement is there. Of course, there is mismanagement. But this is true for all the countries where most of the countries where China has given loans and invested. Mr. Gao says, infrastructure is what takes a country forward. I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with Mr. Gao. It is infrastructure, whether it's United States, India, China. The key is infrastructure. But at what cost? Can the country repay that cost? Can Laos repay China? Can Kenya repay China? Can Sri Lanka repay China? Can Pakistan repay China? Can Nepal repay China? Can the Central African Republics repay China? I think not. Because these loans are not structured.
Absolutely.
6.5%. There is no way. There is no way you can
straight away. I'll toss this. Absolutely. I'll toss this over to Mr. Gao. Mr. Gao, respond to what Major Gaurav Arya has to say. You know it very well. None of these countries can actually repay. And you are well aware of it. And this arm twisting tactics of yours is,
let me add a couple
it's from
of
your
points.
Communist Party playbook.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm very happy that the panelists agreed with my conclusion that infrastructure is an absolutely very important precondition for any development. Secondly, he mentioned several things. Let me tell you, World Bank lends not to build infrastructure. World Bank lends to alleviate poverty. It's not for development purposes. It's for poverty alleviation. You mentioned IMF. Do you know what does IMF loan mean? What's the purpose of IMF loans? It's not for infrastructure. It's to bail out a country which defaults on its sovereign debt. So when you use IMF loan, then you are in deep trouble. So don't talk to me about IMF loan or World Bank loan, lower rates, etc. It's completely absurd. When you talk about commercial loans, the Chinese package is always combining development assistance on the one hand, and then corporates from China and elsewhere which will need to pitch in to develop the projects. Now, I just came back from Sanya in Hainan Island. They are building huge projects. They are building the Round Island high-speed railway. They are building quite a few airports, etc. Waiting for what? Waiting for the pickup of economic development, global
Mr. Gao,
tourism,
I also have
etc.
other...
You cannot wait until tourists come and
Mr. Gao, you made a point.
If I borrow a loan, it's my responsibility to repay my loan, rather than, for example, blame the debtor for creating what the Americans
there is no doubt
have
but the question, Mr. Gao, you're still not answering Gaurav Arya's question. You know it very well that none of these countries that you were actually giving loan to, they were in a position to repay. Weren't you aware of the fact? I want Mr. Sangha, who was making a point, unfortunately we lost his audio line and his video line. Our other guests are also joining in. We'll be shifting gears in a short while from now. But Mr. Asanga, I want you to complete your point. You've heard Mr. Gao making this point that, look here, infrastructure is crucial for any developing nation. There's absolutely no debate on that. But the point here is that what I'm trying to reiterate is that you are basically creating a situation where the nation is piggy banking on China simply because of the fact that they are not in a position to repay the loans. And then what really happens is that arm twisting begins. Classic of China, playbook of the Communist Party.
Clearly, Sri Lanka, I mean, Rajapaksa has followed China bandwagoning foreign policy. And, we first time spoke about multiple, even on the human rights concerns about China. So our foreign policy filtered to China. Clear. But the protesters are angry that they have not seen this agreement. Protesters, they have not seen. I have interviewed several protesters. So they are angry because of the transparency is missing. Why did he have to pay 24 hours before he came to Sri Lanka? And these are the things that we don't need to pay 24 hours before, when he came to Sri Lanka, we paid for the fertilizer shipment. I mean, these should have been done in, countries should function in proper processes, procedures, the EIA processes, the environmental clearance, the accountability, transparency. All these have to be there. So none of the Sri Lankans have, the public have not seen they have not seen the special economic zone conditionality. So I mean, they were debated, discussed, immediately taken to the parliament and approved without much public discussion. So it is what has happened right now is a complete dysfunctionality.
Mr. Sangha.
Yes.
Thank you very much for making that point. Let me also, quickly focus the other important issue, and perhaps that's slightly political here in India. We also have more guests joining in right now. Vikraman, spokesperson of the VCK, Anirban Banerjee and Jitendra Kumar Oja joining us. Anirban Banerjee, I want to take this question to you. Here in India, we seem to be seeing the opposition celebrating. You've had the Mehbooba Muftis celebrating and saying that what happened in Sri Lanka should serve as a wake-up call. Since 2014, India is being whipped into a communal frenzy and imagined fears. What exactly is there to really celebrate, and how exactly are these comments essentially being made where the opposition seems to be saying, egging that, okay, look here, this is the fate that we are going to witness. We aren't really relying on the Chinese.
No, it is not a statement of celebration for sure by the opposition. It is rather an expression of worry, if I may say so, that the way the Modi-led government has done its acts, or rather,
both of them, Anirban, this is exactly what I want to understand. It's absolutely fine for the opposition parties to raise their own concerns, but how are these two? Anirban, the point here is that, I'm sorry that I have to interrupt you and not allow you to continue, because the reason being very simple. How are these two situations same? Or rather, how are you bringing them on the same platform?
See, there are some very striking and uncanny similarities between the way Rajapaksa has steered the Sri Lankan government to the situation that they are in right now, the entire country, to what Mr. Narendra Modi has done post 2014. Both are authoritarian governments, and both governments have continuously amassed power from the states and created a very, very highly centralized system of governing the country. The states hardly have any say to making of policies that affect the entire country. It is quite similar to what has happened in Sri Lanka. Mr. Rajapaksa is taking every decision out of his own regard.
No, it's not similar, Anirban. It's not similar. Let me just give you some statistics also here.
Every concern for the democratic procedures.
Anirban, if you really understand the current situation in Sri Lanka, if you really understand the current situation in Sri Lanka, that's also because of the policies in place. Now, how can India essentially be compared to the crisis-stricken Sri Lanka when India has exponential rise of merchandise exports from $291 billion in 2020 to $418 billion. I'm just giving you one fact. I can still go on right now. I also wanted Jitendra Kumar Oja to step in right now. How exactly is the opposition party bringing the two situations absolutely unlike being brought on the same platform? I'll give you one example. I can continue giving you more examples. Jitendra Kumar Oja.
my primary area is geopolitics in South Asia. So I think the opposition parties are very ignorant. In this region, what we are witnessing, a kind of rivalry between China and India. China has been trying to establish its hegemony and dominance. And we all know that Hambantota project that they took, that project was commercially unsustainable. This is a dual-use project. Its primary objective was military. They wanted to secure or rather have a base in Indian Ocean. Similarly, projects like Matale in Colombo, Matale in Sri Lanka, you see, this airport was unsustainable. So what Chinese have done, with due respect, I respect Professor Gao, he's a very eminent intellectual. But for China, even masses don't matter. Leave aside other countries. They think they are preeminent. They are a very unique kind of civilization, supreme civilization in the world. And the rest of the people exist only to serve their own agenda. And they have no aspiration. They should not have any aspiration at all. So I can very well understand what he's trying to see. But fact is that democracies in general are vulnerable. In most of these neo-colonial or rather post-colonial democracies, they have perfected a neo-colonial model. They have tried to corrupt their elite in some way or the other, tried to exploit gaps and loopholes which are available. And that is
right.
what, I'm not saying that Americans are. Let me complete. Just few seconds to give me. So this is the kind of thing which has played out in Sri Lanka. They have corrupted Rajapaksa family. This family dismantled most of the institutions. Governance for all practical purposes has collapsed. This situation cannot be compared with India. India is a very benevolent country. Sri Lanka is civilizationally part of us, but we have respected their territory. We have respected their sovereignty. Yes, we should step in there and see that our Chinese friends, they are restrained. They are kept in their own track. And rest of the world, and especially post-colonial democracies, they are safe. I have completed.
Vikraman, I want you to respond. How exactly are you comparing it, especially given the fact that, unlike what the Chinese have been doing, remember, we've always been available to the Sri Lankans the most in their crisis moments. Also, India has played a pivotal role. And still, the opposition parties here are basically saying that, look here, we are headed the Sri Lankan way.
Of course, we are headed the Sri Lankan way. In Sri Lanka, why this crisis is happening? Because of the poor economic policies of the government and the sheer lackadaisical attitude of the rulers. They were running the country like their own family parivar. The Rajapaksa family has looted the country, leaving no space for any institutions to act independently. A similar thing, the Reserve Bank governor, the people demanded the Reserve Bank governor to step down in Sri Lanka. Why? Because he was a puppet of Rajapaksa. Similar thing here also, we have institutions which are not independent here. Here CBI is not independent, even the judiciary is not independent. See, what we are saying is we are warning this government of imminent danger. The neighboring country is facing such a crisis. It might come here also. Why Agnipath has turned ugly here? Why so much of violent protests in Bihar, UP, and
I
all
want Jitendra
the
Ocha. Jitendra Ocha, why don't you quickly respond? And also Gaurav Arya, if you can quickly come in. First, I want Jitendra Ocha to respond on the Agniveer issue also. On the Agniveer issue, we seem to be seeing that political parties are bringing this Agniveer issue also. Gaurav Arya, you can come in, but first Jitendra Ocha.
Yes. On matters of foreign policy and national security, government, opposition and civil society, they have to be on the same page. We have to protect Indian civilization, we must say. And Sri Lanka, I was just speaking to most eminent civil society leader of Sri Lanka just half an hour back. He is running a movement called Sarvodaya Movement. His name is A.T. Aryaratne, 90-year-old man. He was a disciple of Vinoba Bhave. And this is what he's saying. We are more Indians than most of India. Fact is that Sri Lanka is part of civilizational identity called India. Yes, we have to perfect a better model of democratic governance, not only for ourselves, but for entire region and most of the world. What is this Chinese model we are talking about? It is outcome of the Western capitalist greed. Now this small caucus in China has enormous resources at its disposal. It wants to colonize the rest of the world.
I'm running out of time. A quick word from Gaurav Arya also.
But we have to be very careful that we don't allow issues
absolutely.
Like
Gaurav Arya, on the point of Agniveer, we've seen the opposition parties being desperately trying to connect this. I still can't wrap my head around this entire so-called illogical link here. How is Agniveer to be brought into this? Anirban, you can respond, but I don't have much time. So, Gaurav Arya, 15 seconds, and then Anirban can also get her time to respond.
See, they have no clue about Agniveer or Agnipath. These are just desperate people who want to win elections. Somehow win elections and come to the center. They are not able to go beyond 1 or 2 states. Their political parties, these are regional political parties, mostly run by one family. Not every party, but many of them. And they desperately want to come out, somehow point out that, the army is not doing this and this is not doing that.
BJP
they have no clue
right
about,
BJP is running family politics.
Sir, just hold on.
Look at Jay Shah, who is the son of
please, you're being rude.
Vikraman, I'll come to you. Let Gaurav Arya.
You're being rude.
Vikraman, allow Gaurav Arya to make that point. Allow. No one is going to understand. I'm really running short of time. Gaurav Arya, quickly just make your point, and then I'll Vikraman, then you can make your point. Let Gaurav Arya complete his point.
Shawan, I think this gentleman is very hurt by this family politics point that I gave. He's very deeply hurt. I think his bosses are, I think, all of them, grandfather, father, everybody. I think they're very deeply hurt. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry if it hurts you.
Anirban, respond. No, Anirban, it's all good. See, Anirban, just a quick point. Anirban, unlike we have a Chinese guest on this panel also.
Yes.
Anirban, I think it's a perfect day to showcase at least. Anirban, at least Mr. Gao can't go back and really have these kind of debates in Beijing. But here in India, we can. You are allowed to criticize, and valid criticism is always acceptable, Anirban. So I think so. The greatest example is tonight when we have a guest coming in from Beijing. He's actually seeing this kind of dialogue that's happening. Anirban, quick point. One quick point. At least admit the fact that at least we can debate.
Simple thing. The Indian currency is performing at its worst. For the first time, it has touched 80 against a single American dollar. This has never happened in the history. The LPG prices are at their highest. Aren't you worried? Aren't you afraid? I am afraid that we might run the Sri Lankan way. The Sri Lankan way was specifically this. None of the markers in India are more improved than Sri Lanka. They are not.
I think we should have a discussion on Indian issues separately. Right now we are discussing Sri Lanka. Let us focus on Sri Lanka.
No, we are not discussing just Sri Lanka. We are drawing parallels to Sri Lanka.
Thank you. I'm really running out of time. I know this is a politically hot debate. And Anirban, just one quick point before I end the debate. There is no doubt about the fact that there are several issues which needs to be debated, and I think so we would be. Unlike the Chinese, we have the liberty to question our government. We have the liberty to actually question the policies of our government. I think so we should be doing that also, and I think so, Anirban, we'll have another debate also. You can raise those questions. And thank you very much, Gaurav Arya, for succinctly putting a lot of points tonight, because these are issues which matter the most. Dhanananta, Fernando Asanga, Victor Gao, Jitendra Kumar Oja, Vikraman and Anirban Banerjee, thank you very much for joining us on The Burning Question.
Getting a cab these days is nearly impossible because half the time you don't get rides. Even if your cab gets booked, you're not